Right. Welcome back, everybody. I guess, well, we can go in order of the groups and start with group one, unless one of the other groups is just dying to go first. But if not, why don't we just start with group one for your report, and you have about 10 minutes. Take it away.
Okay, hi, this is Deborah. We decided that I was going to give the report since I'm the one who's been taking the notes and I've got the document in front of me. I'm actually not quite finished putting together the notes for the session we just had, but I'll just add them onto that. And I have a Google Doc that where I'm going to submit to that I've already got in the folder for the planning meeting, so people can look at that too. We worked on one question per day. The first session we looked at the question about what should DS do for you as a researcher, instructor, student, or collection manager. And especially, I think there was a lot of consensus that there needs to be a broad, very wide swath of images and types of catalogs, types of records, and types of metadata. That people had a lot of ideas about how to have a less onerous way to contribute data. We need a lower bar for institutions to enter. We want to support the study of the global Middle Ages. We'd like to appeal more to K through 12 instruction using more visual tools, and they were thinking about DS being something more than just a catalog, that we could have timeline functions, geomapping functions, videos. Also, an idea that came up that day was to, it would be great to have some, be able to put up a record with no metadata, with images and no metadata at all, and have a way for users to help to contribute information for what we were calling mystery manuscripts. On the second day, we talked about barriers for entry for small institutions. There is a cost, a lack of expertise. They don't have a lot of money. They don't have a digitization program. For large institutions, there's barriers because they already have their own digital library. They don't feel like they need another one. They also, for large institutions, making multiple versions of their records for different repositories is onerous. But then we also have the advantages for participation for both small and large was that there's opportunity of a union catalog allows for comprehensive search. It gives the manuscripts in the collections more visibility, and it also encourages cooperation among the collections. And there was a idea that, if we had regional hubs across the country, then the large institutions could help the small institutions. The challenges include, how to manage institutional will. How do you get your own institution to get behind, maybe the efforts of just one curator? And one of the ideas that came out of that was could let experts from large institutions visit small institutions and teach or even make videos about the small institutions' collections to help the people who manage those collections get the institution to understand that they've got a really interesting and valuable collection that needs to be shared. Then on the third day, we talked about what would be better for DS, a registry or a union catalog with full records, and we went back and forth among with those pros and cons. And we decided that there should be a sweet spot that should be something between a registry and a union catalog, that perhaps we could have a catalog with tiers of access so there'd be a minimal record, but an option for a full record. And again, an option for a digitized manuscript with no record that encouraged crowdsourcing. And then today we talked about the question that has to do with what should be the scope of DS, and everyone seemed to be in agreement. We would like DS to support the study of the global Middle Ages. and to expand the sort of the reach of DS, not just in theory, but in practice. So that brings challenges, of course, like how does metadata manage like lots of different traditions? And then also can we increase the representation in the membership and the board to include more people and more collections that have a non-Western focus? And then we also talked about the scalability of diversification, because that means we're going way beyond the Conway-Davis census in terms of numbers. And then we also talked about sort of related to this, how to manage images, but I mean, clearly the technology is there for us to use distributed image storage to help us bring in all these diverse collections. I don't know if anybody else from my group wants to add something. Ray, did I leave anything out?
No, that was great. It was we had great discussions. They were really wide ranging. We thought things like the openness to non-Western was really important, and reaching out to smaller collections. So no, I thought that was great. Thank you. Emma, does that help you too?
Yeah, yeah, thanks. Does anyone have any questions for group one before we move on? If not, group two, we're ready for you.
Yeah, all right, that's going to be me. I have a summary document also. I'm putting a link.
Oh, you muted yourself, Lisa.
Sorry, there we go. I've added a link to our summary in the chat, Emma, so you can do what you want with that. We agreed with group one in a lot of things. So in terms of what manuscripts, let's do them all. Let institutions decide what they want to include, and then give users the ability to filter to get what they want specifically. So really lower the bar there and let institutions decide. We were a little bit torn about archival material. You know, there may be some lines in the sand that we're going to have to draw. In terms of what a record should be, we obviously what we want in the ideal world is the most fulsome data possible, but we should certainly accept minimal records, again, to lower the bar for participation. In terms of what should be absolutely mandatory, that too, we all agreed all you really have to have is some kind of a locator or a unique identifier. We also thought one thing that we needed to do is to return to the user survey from a few years ago to see how researchers use Digital Scriptorium and what they actually want. And that's, you know, a different way of looking at Digital Scriptorium than the survey to institutions that we sent out a few months ago. So we definitely need to revisit that data. And I think Janine has access to that. Someone has that data. Or Deborah, maybe you do. I'm not sure who actually has access to that data, but it's there. How does Digital Scriptorium 2.0 balance the needs of large and small institutions? First of all, by spelling correctly. We really want to avoid this issue of duplicating data. This is what has really been a problem especially for large institutions. We want to avoid manual updating in multiple places. It would be great to link out to pre-existing records from large institutions, or maybe we can reverse the workflow and have Digital Scriptorium be the record of record and let the institution export and ingest the data into their own repository instead of going the other way around. That puts an onus on Digital Scriptorium to update the data. So that's something to think about in terms of staffing. And for smaller institutions that don't have a repository, Digital Scriptorium can continue to be the born digital space for records and images. We'd love to see some kind of fellowships offered for cataloging to help institutions that need it so that that labor is not unpaid. That also provides really fantastic training for a postdoc or two. Also we may want to think about the peripheral manuscripts model, these local consortia that can work together to support one another in terms of cataloging and imaging. We all really liked the Metascripta model for discoverability. Just a few filters, maybe also including author and title with linked data and authorities. I had the question of whether Digital Scriptorium can ingest census supplement records from the Schoenberg database in order to provide skeletal data for the institutions that still use the census and supplement as their catalog until and if those records get updated. That is a way to get thousands of records into Digital Scriptorium quickly. But as I discovered, it's not as easy as I thought it would be. I was able to very easily filter and find all of the census and supplement records in the database, but when I exported them, some very important data doesn't get exported in that way. So that may be something to revisit if it's technically possible. I think that would be great, and then you don't have to recreate the wheel with all of those records, since those records already exist. In terms of images, if possible for institutions that already have IIIF manifests and some kind of a shared Canvas viewer, we would love to be able to mirror those into Digital Scriptorium with an embedded viewer. That would be swell. Question, of course, should Digital Scriptorium also store images or only link to them? We didn't really come to a consensus, but we think probably depending on the needs of each institution, it may be financially unsustainable to store more than necessary, and we may have to continue limiting the number of images per institution, although that's not ideal. And as Allison points out, we want all the images all the time as high resolution as possible, cover to cover. Is that so much to ask? Really, we don't ask for much as researchers. There's nothing more frustrating than going to a Digital Scriptorium record and discovering that the leaf you really want is the leaf after the one that's been digitized for those early records that just have selected images. Now dreaming, where should Digital Scriptorium live? We weren't clear as to whether Digital Scriptorium actually has the option to stay at UC Berkeley after we rebuild the data model. I wasn't quite clear about that. If we have to leave Berkeley, what kind of institution would be a best fit? Do we want to be in a university or more of an independent institution? Regardless, we need a institution of some kind with a long-term commitment to manuscript studies, Himmel, Sims, the Beinecke, the Library of Congress, maybe the Medieval Academy of America. I don't know how that would work, but if we're blue skying it, you know, the Medieval Academy is an organization committed to supporting medieval studies in North America. So that if that could somehow be worked out, I have no idea how that might work, but we're blue skying it. So I threw that out there. And then of course, how do we sustain Digital Scriptorium? The financial model is always the big challenge, and we may need to continue the current fee structure in order to be financially sustainable. I think that's it. Anyone in my group have anything else to add to all of that? No? All right, thank you all very much. It was really, we had some really great conversations, really useful discussions. It was really enlightening.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Group 2. Group 3, ready?
Yeah, so Group 3, which was an awesome group, by the way. Thank you, everybody, for your good contributions. we took a different approach. We used the questions that were in the handout as a kind of starting point, but then the summary that we've come up with asks all these questions in different ways. So I think what I want to do is share my screen. So everybody can follow along. So the first question, what is the scope of DS 2.0? I think we're all sort of in agreement, as with everybody else, it sounds like, that it needs to be institutionally inclusive.
Could you widen that, Lynn? Just,
Yeah, maybe.
I think you have a plus button there.
How's that?
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so global in content. It also needs to be open access, and we talked a little bit about what open access means. It means that it needs to be free to users, as it is now. And we also think, our group also thought that it meant that it needs to be full open access to data, to metadata and images, so that the data that's in Digital Scriptorium is available to everybody. So institutions would have to relinquish some control over their metadata and their images. That would be part of the agreement. We thought about what the purpose of DS 2.0 was. And I asked people to think about, like, what is the primary question when people come to DS 2.0? What are they going to ask? And the options are, in terms of purpose, options are research, discovery, and aggregation. But I think we all agreed that the key purpose was to find manuscripts, right? So the question, what manuscripts or type of manuscripts are in X place, whether that's an institution, a city, a state in the US, right? So you could break it down by those locations and by certain types of elements. And we also thought that research and analysis was actually secondary to the purpose of DS 2.0. And if we had to cut something from the plan, it might be that ability to take and analyze data. Then we thought about, how do you find manuscripts? If the purpose of DS 2.0 is to find manuscripts, how do you find them? And we came up with a list of data elements that would be sort of the obvious ones: shelf mark, author, creator, title or work, language data production, place of production, decoration, whether that's whatever that means, illustration or illumination. We also recognize that some of the desired data elements might not be accessible in DS 2.0. So script, right? It's going to be really hard to find manuscripts in DS 2.0 based on script. It's really hard to standardize that. And so Ruth Rogers pointed out that DS can only do what the data in it will allow. And so when you're thinking about how to use DS 2.0 or how to create a data model, what will the data allow you to do that's in there? You can't ask it to do everything. It's not a magic box. And I thought that's a really important point for us to remember. The next thing we thought about was, who does the work and how does the work flow? You know, what is the workflow for DS 2.0? I think we all agreed that that a manuscript should just have one metadata record that the institutions manage and make available for export to a DS 2.0 environment. DS 2.0 manages that export and the import of data and a regular schedule for updates. We also agreed that the institutions have to host their own images, that DS 2.0 can facilitate finding hosts for small institutions, but will not be responsible for the hosting. So like one of the services we could provide is hooking you up to the people at Open, for example, or some other similar place to host images. Another point that was made was DS 2.0 must aspire to balance labor and expectations of what institutions do and what Digital Scriptorium does. That's more sort of a principle, a point of principle. DS 2.0 can also make the aggregated data available to other constituencies, such as international partners. So institutions don't have to do the work of getting their data out there and participating in international projects with their manuscript data if they don't have the institutional framework to support that. But that's something DS 2.0. So we could be that sort of clearinghouse for projects like ISME or something. Someone thought of a DS 2.0 could be sort of a manuscript or have a manuscript helpline feature. So I think this has already come up in a number of other groups where there might be a body of volunteers, experts, or we could find funding for fellowships so that you could come as an institution, come to DS, say, I need help with my manuscripts and cataloging. Can you facilitate that? And we can provide that community that would be able to do that. And then sort of following along that we would enable and facilitate collaborations and partnerships for grants to support manuscript cataloging practices. If any of you are familiar with the PAC School Consortium in Philadelphia, the Consortium of Special Collections Libraries, that's something that PAC School does well. It brings partners together, writes the grants that get the work done for the institutions. And then we thought about, in terms of, as we were thinking about what DS 2.0 does and what the institutions have to do, we started thinking about how, or what the benefits of being involved in this. Why would you pay this membership fee, or why would you do the work to get your data in there? And we came up with a number of points. First, it offers a platform for standardization of manuscript description, including managing name and place authorities for this process. We could, DS 2.0 could set the standard. If you want your data in DS 2.0, it needs to look like this. It could provide support for smaller institutions to describe and publish manuscript collections on a national platform. And we're thinking of these as like, if you have to go to your institute, to your administrators and make a case for DS 2.0, what do you say? So the smaller institutions can get support, and the larger institutions can say that they're part of a national union catalog and you don't want to be left out. That you need to have your, PEN needs to have its data in this aggregated environment. It places a certain value on the importance of cultural heritage research, and it allows institutions to highlight unique collections on a national platform. It can also create and manage manuscript ID numbers for US manuscripts, and this is something that's come up a little bit in discussions in the last couple of weeks. And I think this would be a very important service that DS 2.0 could provide that one institution can't do on its own. We kind of punted a little bit on how images fit in. I think that's the difficult question. They're key. Everybody wants images, but how? At a minimum, DS 2.0 needs to provide links to images. Ideally, it would have some kind of like triple IF functionality to pull in images into the environment. Fragmentarium is an obvious model of how to do that. Fragmentarium doesn't host the images at the fragments, but it enables bringing them into the environment for study. So I think that's it. Yeah, if there are any questions, or if I've missed anything, team 3, please feel free to jump in.
Thank you so much, Lynn. That's a lot of great ideas. And I think we'll have some things to discuss afterwards. But if does anyone have any questions for group 3? No? If not, we can move on to group 4.
So on the assumption that group 4 made, as we talk through all of these points, that we would be kind of putting the fine art, kind of bringing it on home, because so much overlaps between the conversations of the 3 groups. So Erin Folder and Emma Sarconi are going to share just some of the framing of the conversations that we had in the last couple of days. Erin, do you want to share?
Sure.
Thanks.
So we had, like many of you all, had really great conversations, and our conversations really centered around 3 particular aspects that shouldn't come as a surprise. One is the need for a metadata structure And that, this is an opportunity perhaps for Digital Scriptorium to push the field to sort of standardize some sort of minimum metadata, whatever that looks like, in order to think about how we discover and make manuscripts available sort of across a lot of platforms. We talked about how many different ways there are to describe a manuscript and the standards and their strengths and weaknesses, and that the Digital Scriptorium should definitely have some sort of minimum, but that whatever standard or whatever metadata model you come up with has to have some sort of modularity so that there can be added value description in some way, whether that's linking out to other institutions that have more robust metadata, or whether Digital Scriptorium can sort of host a greater depth of description on some set of records. The second was really this known gap where we have some institutions with a lot of expertise and other institutions with almost no expertise. And that can range from anything where they have a couple of manuscript holdings but no manuscript cataloger, to folks who have manuscript catalogers but don't have the subject or particular expertise for some topical, regional, temporal space. And so that Digital Scriptorium, part of its service is really around bridging that gap. We talked about several models. We've talked about regional hubs, which have come up in a couple of other places. We talked about, if you're a Digital Scriptorium member, you get access to, essentially other institutions' resources, time, money, et cetera, to learn or to have your materials cataloged. And, we also talked, I think, a little bit about funding opportunities for some sort of roving cataloger to go to institutions that have sort of cataloging gaps to try and help fill that expertise gap. And then the third thing we talked about a lot was sort of this scope definition. What's included and what's excluded and why? I think by and large, we were agreed that it needed to actively include non-Western materials, and that by definition, that pushes sort of the more traditional temporal boundaries of what medieval means and what manuscript means. And that in doing so, we may start to see institutions reevaluating their own materials and reevaluating the value of Digital Scriptorium and being able to contribute in some way. And that this scope definition is also going to help define and be defined by the first two elements, right? Your metadata structure, as well as this sort of shared expertise and that the need to fill that shared expertise. We also talked about that researchers still need to do research. I think Emma, maybe you said that, but basically this cannot be the one-stop shop for everything. And that Digital Scriptorium needs to think very strategically about how it can lead researchers to the kind of in-depth information that they need to do their analysis and do their research, while still providing the kind of level of metadata granularity and perhaps even images to get them started in that research process.
And then Emma, do you want to share the kind of framing?
Sure. So just one of the last things that we talked about was the need for sort of an elevator pitch or a short, snappy one-liner that really sums up what Digital Scriptorium does for the community. We think that having something that's really straightforward, that's really to the point, will help sort of answer these questions of scope and value, and also bring people in, know what they're getting into and what we're here for. So it also will speak to community as well. So we really think that as we sort of develop what Digital Scriptorium is going to be moving forward, how we package it, how we think about it will also be important.
And then we said a lot of things that everyone else has already said. So is there anyone else in group 4 that wants to raise something that perhaps we missed in this little recap? We had a fantastic time though.
Thank you so much, group 4. It's really interesting how the different groups approached the activity. I like how some of you stuck to the questions and some of you paved your own way. We have a lot to think about. One thing that's becoming clear is that you know, DS needs to market itself beyond just providing this like service of a database, but like DS is a community that's dedicated to manuscript data. And I wonder, I know some of you are joining us from institutions that aren't currently members of DS, and I wonder, are you feeling that you have you know, enough to take to your institution to make the case to join DS? I'm not saying like you know, you're gonna sign up tomorrow, but I'm just wondering if there's enough consensus about the point of DS that you could convince your administrators to join. Maybe not, and maybe we need to talk about this more, because I think for this union catalog to work, we have to get enough people on board. You know, DS has 34 members and associates right now, and it seems like we're honing in more on what we're going to provide as far as like promoting roving catalogers and funding them appropriately to support smaller institutions, having different levels of access as far as, you know, how much data you need to contribute to participate in DS. Does anyone have any thoughts about how we can make our case more?
I saw Bridget Werty raise her hand earlier. Do you still want to jump in? I think you need to yeah.
So I come from one of the institutions that counts as very small. We had one bound medieval codex when I started my job here in 2015. Now we have 6. It's been very exciting growth and fundraising. Just thinking about the talking points that you've given us as Digital Scriptorium marketing itself as a community that's committed to manuscript data and the global Middle Ages. Those are 3 talking points that would make it so I could go to different pots of money at the institution. If it was, like, this lets me talk to the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. This lets me lean on our new but extremely well-funded data sciences initiative, and sort of lean on more of the global Middle Ages and our institution's talking points about race and diversity. So those as talking points might get me somewhere. I am looking at the weighted fee schedule from the Digital Scriptorium webpage. I think that between our student body, our budget, and our number of manuscripts, we might be in the tier 1, tier 2. And even under this level of austerity, with the kind of marketing you're talking about, I could probably make a more convincing case, certainly than I could have in the past.
That's good to hear. Anyone else have anything to add?
That's just such an exciting idea for me to think that diversifying and expanding the reach of the collections and is actually a wonderful marketing strategy. It's to me, a light bulb just went off in my head. This is pretty exciting to think about that way. Thank you, Bridget.
Elizabeth, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that my experience in getting my institution to join was that what was absolutely key was to play the cost sharing game between the library and another body on campus, and particularly when the other body on campus was not state funded. So I was asking them to dig into their income from endowment to the tune of half of the membership. And it was because half would be paid by that group that the university libraries were willing to go in on it. Even though given the parameters of the collection and the institution, our annual membership is really quite modest.
Right. Another thing I noted was that people seem to be dancing around the images problem. What do people think about images? I know a couple people here who think images are not necessary for our union catalog, and I know many of you disagree. Who wants to make their case about images?
I could share one brief comment.
Mm-hmm.
Hey everybody, obviously I'm pretty new here, but I was just commenting in my group on the technology part. Compared to 5 years ago, image hosting and image delivery is much more straightforward and solved. When you add in cloud services, the cost has gone way down. So I don't, having just worked on Metascript, I don't see it as big of a challenge as it used to be. There does have to be some money set aside for image delivery or hosting if you choose to do that, but it's not like it was even a couple years ago. And I think it's only going to get better. And I don't know if Ben has a comment about that as well, Ben Albritton.
He had to leave for another meeting, unfortunately. But as far as like, I'm asking you, Ben, like if we were actually going to try to provide images for every manuscript or fragment in the US, is that possible for you know, a consortium that has hardly any money to spend?
It depends what you mean by hardly any money, but if you're talking about millions of images, 1 million, or like hundreds of thousands, what's your scale there?
That I wouldn't know.
Take a guess.
Lisa, have you thought about this?
I'm running the numbers. Hang on, I'm thinking.
It would definitely be millions if we're talking about
Yeah.
fully digitized manuscripts. I mean,
Yeah.
we're talking from the Metascripta project, we're talking ultimately 8 million images.
So
But we're not talking about Digital Scriptorium necessarily holding and storing all of those images, because
Right.
the hundreds of thousands of images already exist and are stored on institutional servers. We just need to either mirror them through IIIF or link out to them.
yeah.
And it's not just, for me, it's not just a financial question, it's also a maintenance question.
Right.
Yep.
You know, you have to maintain that image metadata. Whereas,
If I could, sorry, Lynn. I think that we have to weigh, I mean, yes, we can use IIIF to link to externally hosted images, but, you know, is that a tried and tested method that will last a long time? I mean, we have to weigh the potential drawbacks, you know, if institutions change or end support for their hosted images, you know, and we need just to weigh the technical difficulty of linking all of that data with perhaps the drawback of duplicating data, which, I mean, I think we also need to look at the cost curve of how hosting large amounts of images is being reduced over time. And, you know, when will we get to 8 million images? Probably several decades from now, right? So at that point, you know, it might not even be an issue, the cost of you know, hosting all those images.
I'd be curious to know how many images are available already. How many manuscripts have been digitized cover to cover in the US? I think it's a lot.
A lot. I mean, it's got to be at least 10,000, I would think, if not more. There's a lot.
Yeah. So that number could get, you know, we could get to the millions very quickly, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing to keep in mind, though, is that manuscript records should not be excluded because they don't have images, right. I think. They can always add images later if they get the work digitized, but it would still be good to have records of what's out there.
Well, yeah, I mean, it just adds to the use in terms of discoverability. You know, if we decide that you could just have a record even if it's just a skeletal record that, you know, a stub that doesn't have images, as long as it's discoverable in some way. Is that, I mean, that's kind of an existential question that we have to answer. Does Digital Scriptorium require images?
I think it would be cool if we could be flexible either way. Have a record with images and no metadata, or have a record with metadata and no images, because institutions have different needs about this.
Yep.
So why not?
I wonder too, talking about a community of experts and talking so much about the cataloging teams that can go out and help institutions with metadata. Maybe something Digital Scriptorium can also offer are teams of imaging specialists to go up and set up mini labs and help get high quality, high resolution images to whatever certain standards, and have that be part of the package as well, to put that metadata and image on equal footing, that it's a service that both might potentially be services that DS could provide.
That would be amazing.
That's a cool idea.
Bill, you had something, Dad?
Just because Allison Stone seems to have left the meeting, but she said in our group, I mean, half jokingly, she doesn't trust anybody's cataloging. She wants to see the pictures. And I think we need to have that kind of range. And I think that's important. But as she said, you know, you're only as good as the data. And if she's on a particular problem, she wants to see the images.
Sure. But does that then mean that we shouldn't allow records without images?
Not at all.
Okay.
Not at all.
I think something that we discussed in group 2 with Lisa and Bill and others is, you know, whether the records on DS 2.0 are those, do they merely copy records that are held institutionally, or does that become, is it a kind of cataloging interface? Does it become the record of record for that manuscript? And do we in turn ask institutions to export out? I mean, does this, you know, it strikes me that this will be the focus of expertise across the country. And, you know, this may be, you know, one model is a kind of ecodices model where there's kind of new cataloging, continuously updated. I mean, we all know that, you know, the cataloging of a medieval manuscript is never finished, right? There's always new discoveries and changes and improvements. So, you know, do we aim to build a kind of catalog, you know, a content management system that allows us to potentially different people, you know, people who don't work for the institution, but who work for DS, or work for a different institution, or are retired like Bill, to come in and improve the cataloging? Or is that not what we're aiming for? Just a question.
Do you really want to answer?
Sure, from someone, yeah, from anyone, yeah, sure, yeah.
I would say that we don't want that responsibility. I think the institution has to be responsible for the record of record. And I think we can facilitate getting scholars in communication with the institutions to keep their records updated. But I do think an aspiration for DS 2.0 to be the record of, you know, the best record. It's unwieldy, and it's too hard to keep up. Because I think that was the intention at the beginning, right? And we have not been able to achieve that because institutions do what institutions want to do.
Otherwise, you end up with a Facebook problem where you've got the organization having this heavy responsibility for the accuracy of the records. That's really rough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, you know, if we had $1 gajillion.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's another major issue that we have to figure out, right? Like, we're operating on a shoestring budget, and I mean, we saw what it costs to make and maintain ecodices. Like, I don't think, I mean, maybe a miracle will happen.
Yeah. Wasn't it 350,000 a year? Isn't that what he said?
Yeah. Although we should, you know, one should caution that, I mean, Switzerland is one of the most expensive No, but I mean, you know, an assistant professor in Switzerland makes like 150,000 or 200,000 francs, right?
It's
So,
really funny.
you know, it seriously, I mean, it you know, the cost would be different, but I think we're going to need dedicated staff. I mean, we need, you know, a major grant to do this, and I think having a, you know, we need to be ambitious in our scope.
I think that
We need an endowment, and we've tried to start that. This board has started. We've got a small investment fund started and an investment policy, because an endowment would really help it. Like, to Doug, you go ahead. You want to talk?
I was just saying, I think that you need to really focus on what the core value and function of DS is, and if you add on to it other responsibilities, whether it's image hosting or a cataloging data management interface itself, content management interface, then you distract from that. And I think that core responsibility of DS is already complicated enough, and you having clarity there is really important. Clarity and focus.
I was just thinking that DS may have to decide which of its ambitions, and this is maybe another way of saying what Doug just said, which of its ambitions is the most important. And I was very interested in Lisa's idea about how could we get lots of records in quickly, because I think the primary ambition may be coverage. And if that is its primary ambition, it's going to get its value from covering as much of the country as possible, as quickly as possible. So not 8 million images in decades, because if we want to be able to say to administrators, we have to be part of this, this is the union catalog, we need to kind of approach that goal as quickly as possible. And that argues for more flexible metadata and image standards so that we can get there more quickly.
That's a great point, Amy. Are people in agreement that coverage is the core goal? Yeah.
Yeah, you want to be a one-stop shop, right? You want to be the one place where people go to find this kind of material.
I would argue that but that we'd want to be the first stop, maybe not the one stop.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's very good.
Yeah, if your responsibility is that you're the first place that people go, it may mean there are a lot of other things that you don't do, but as someone said either here or in our previous meeting, that researchers still need to do research, right? We can help you locate the thing that you want, and there's other supporting information that you need, and data that you may need, but this responsibility is to help you locate the thing you want before you go off to the next level.
Kivelchin?
I'm just wondering, just following up on this idea, if it's technically possible to, as an initial start, to aggregate data from already existing sources, such as, you know, the current Digital Scriptorium, the OCLC records, Schoenberg database, like Lisa suggested, you know, bring in all the stub records for manuscripts and then give institutions the option, or I don't know, some way of verifying whatever the minimum is set for Digital Scriptorium, and then publishing these draft stub records as, you know, somewhat approved by the institutions, and then go from there. I was also wondering, related to what Lynn suggested about open access data, especially, whether the data can be transparent, as in, you know, this information is approved by a certain institution, or this is just a draft record like the Schoenberg database is doing in some way, like who is responsible
Like, who says this is a 13th century manuscript? I think from a researcher point of view, this is also important to see when this data is updated, when it was created, or where to go from here in some ways. Or if there are going to be tiered descriptions, like a minimum description and a complete description, or full images or selected images, can we also see this information and maybe sort this information too, because that will already be there. But often this is not available to researchers in most of the digitized manuscript environments or catalogs.
Does anyone with technical expertise want to jump in about the possibility of aggregating data from pre-existing places around the internet?
Well, I think WorldCat would be incredibly convoluted and complicated, because the aggregation that they do, they've got now turning manuscript records into bib records with item records, and the data is really messed up in a lot of ways in WorldCat. So I'm not sure that WorldCat is a good resource. Maybe the Digital Public Library of America, which I think handles the data differently. The Schoenberg database, certainly, if that data can be pulled out and crosswalked into Digital Scriptorium records, there's quite a lot there.
I wouldn't be willing to say whether it's completely possible to do this. I think there are sources that you could look at, and I think that you have to answer questions. So WorldCat, as Lisa mentions, it doesn't actually give you what you think you're after necessarily. Like, unless I'm mistaken, I don't think WorldCat has shelf marks for manuscripts in it, because it's local library information. And Amy could correct me if I'm wrong, but and the Schoenberg database is another possible source. There's another point that you were making, Colchum, that I wanted to follow up on. I do like the idea. Yes, I do like the idea of acknowledging the source of the information, so that you're always knowing where it's coming from, whether it was crawled or extracted from other databases, or whether it was actually pushed by the holding institution to your data set.
Lynn, were you going to say something earlier?
I forgot.
That's okay.
I can just clarify. I suggested OCLC records, Lisa, because the survey suggests that more than half of institutions currently either hold or do, like me, actual cataloging on OCLC, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, there's no question that that's what people are doing. It's just extremely difficult, at least using WorldCat, to filter out those records. It's really tough to do.
But it would be good if OCLC records somehow can turn into some other format, which then can be improved on for a lot of other institutions, I think. And this would also help in advertising that this is not going to, give you a lot of, you wouldn't need extra work maybe as much as you would need for creating a catalog record from scratch, however little that might be.
Well, I think what's happening now, and Deborah, you can correct me, but I think because different institutions create these records, if they're using MARC records, everyone does it. Every institution has their own kind of house style for manuscripts in particular, which means that you need an individual customized crosswalk to get out of the OPAC and into Digital Scriptorium.
Yeah, I can tell you that this has been the experience we've had so far. I mean, Berkeley developed, when Yale brought their records in, Berkeley developed a crosswalk for Yale's MARC records. And that's how we got Yale in, because Yale has over 5,000 records in the database, I think. But so recently Oregon joined, and David DiLorenzo wanted to know, well, and he was active in DS when Yale export happen. So he wanted to know, could they use that crosswalk for organs records? And Lisa or Lynn Grigsby looked into it, and turns out, no, they can't. It's designed just for Yale, and it's exactly right, because of the options, and especially because of the workarounds you have to do to make, and I do this and for my job, you have to do a lot of workarounds to make a MARC record for manuscripts, because MARC records were really designed for a transparent printed book. So they're very content heavy. They're not designed to describe artifacts or cultural historical context. And so there's all kinds of workarounds with notes that are not indexed. So it's doable for sure. I think you're almost in an AI environment, artificial intelligence environment, to like comb MARC records and look for the things that you want to put in. You can't really do it with MARC codes, I don't think. It doesn't mean you couldn't do it with some kind of very clever, I don't know, like TEI markup of those records, right? To go in there and look for the things you want. How do you find the name of a script or something like that? So I think it's a cool idea. I don't think that DS has a technology. We definitely don't have technology right now, but I think it could be done. And where I think there might be the issue is, again, we're back to the problem of who owns the records. If DS does that, say we could do it tomorrow, we have the technology, we figure out how to do it. All of a sudden now DS is creating records instead of the institutions. So we're back to that problem of, are we in charge of the records? But I think all these ideas are definitely worth thinking about.
Can I ask about the possibility of, instead of reinventing the wheel necessarily, of leaning heavily on an existing framework like eCodices or like vHIML as a kind of blank slate for us to, and then the problem becomes crosswalking existing records in DS 1.0 and institutional repositories into a kind of almost ready framework. Because I know I sound repetitive, but I keep going back to eCodices. They're dealing with approximately similar, obviously a much smaller country, but an approximately similar number of institutions and manuscripts. And everybody consistently seems to refer to it as the most robust and useful, of course, and most expensive project, but they built it, the framework from the ground up. Maybe there are significant savings from porting that over and using it ourselves.
The other answer is minimal metadata. Just keep it simple and stupid. Really.
I'm on it. I can do that.
Yeah. Go.
Didn't Chris also say like the annual how much is the annual maintenance of eCodices? Was it
350,000?
Yeah.
I don't know if that was dollars or Swiss francs. Does anybody know?
It's about this.
It's almost the same, right? Yeah.
I can tell you that our system is it's not close to that at all. It's probably about $35,000 a year.
Mm-hmm.
And that includes, at this point, I think we have 195 terabytes of images on the image server. So
do you have an idea, Daniel, of how much that's equivalent to, and how many
that's a lot.
pages?
It's about 12 million images, I think.
That's more than Metascript.
Right.
Yeah, and we're going to be adding another, probably within the next, I don't know, 2 years, possibly doubling that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's quite a bit. We've, I would argue that, from the standpoint of like sitting down and designing things, and if Ben is still on here, I think the real Ben from Metascript and the other, our double Ben quotient, I think what I would be arguing is that one way we created, if I can just let me go back, we created this kind of like pilot project a while ago to kind of help out this group in Germany. And I'm not, if I can just get this up real quick. We created it, they were having a lot of the problems that are being discussed here. And they were dealing with, we really threw this together. This was literally like 20 days of work, dropping this line into the thing. And what we ended up doing is creating like a super fast PHP application and a very super simple database. But if you go to an individual record, I'm trying to find one. I mean, this, when I'm talking, this is like as simple as you can get. What you've got here is, this is actually harvesting IIIF URLs from vHML Reading Room. And we created a specialized tiny little database for them so that they could get their project up and running. Which means that if you don't want to do the image server route and you just install Mirador, you can just add the IIIF and not have to worry about it, you know, in a sense it gets DS off the hook, so to speak, if it's just harvesting IIIFs from other places. And I think there's a lot to be said for this from the standpoint of DS, is that it would allow them to have manuscripts without images, or with the opportunity to have them. It gives them both options, but it puts the onus on the owning institution to provide that link. And this is where the kind of regional centers falls into place. So larger institutions that are able to provide long-term storage for these digital images could then just provide that IIIF out to Digital Scriptorium, and then you could have the images there, and then you could code the page that you wouldn't show the viewer, you know, if there was no IIIF link, and then you would just get the data below. And I think that type of model might work very well for Digital Scriptorium. In that way, it removes the burden of how are you going to like pay for, update, and upgrade that image server every couple of years as things change, and it kind of puts that onus on the other institutions while you're just harvesting the manifest. And then at that point, if you did a simplified metadata and just kind of reduced it to a kind of a core knowledge base that scholars would need, I think you've set yourself up for a pretty good model of a pretty good long-term model there. That would be that's kind of what I get out of this. But, you know, running the image server and running the data, you know, it commercially funded IIIF services. I think I sent a link to, it's about $100 per terabyte, just so you know. So I think that's what, it'll get cheaper over time, but I think that's what it's running now. I wouldn't just take eCodices or vHML and like duplicate our stuff that's on GitHub. I think, and that's largely because, not that I'm embarrassed by our work, I think we did a great job, but it's just the technology has advanced so fast since we built this 5 years ago. It's almost out of date. I certainly wouldn't build vHML as we did 5 years ago, now knowing what's out there now. So.
You know, that's, I was just going to say, that's the other problem. If we build something, the more bells and whistles we put on it, the harder the maintenance is, and the more all of those things are be out of date in 10 years, right?
Yeah, that's going to be an issue no matter what route we take. I think, like, we want DS to continue on for decades and decades, and we need to make sure whatever we do can be continued to be improved upon. And, you know, we're always going to be wanting to take advantage of new stuff, new tech that's out there. So if we can make it as light as possible, that makes it easier to update every 5 years or so, if that's possible.
Maybe we need to stop calling this DS 2.0 and call it DS Lite, compared to what the original database model was.
I'm not sure that's a good.
Yeah,
For marketing purposes.
That could be its internal name.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I would argue is that, I mean, now that with this cloud hosting services, you don't really need an institution anymore to host the data. You can just put it into Amazon or Amazon Web Services or any other cloud hosting service. I mean, if that's what you're really aiming for, to avoiding kind of institutional trap. I mean, there are benefits for having it attached to an institution, and there are benefits that are not. And to kind of let you know that even we run up against that with our own, and we'll probably be migrating. I mean, our current project is not being built on St. John's University IT. It's being built completely within AWS. And we'll probably move the next rendition to VHML into a similar environment.
That's really good to know. So what else, like, I think we've all learned a lot over the past 4 days about the possibilities for DS. Has anyone been like shocked with something they've learned, or has your opinion that you came in with about the future of DS, has it changed drastically over the past few days? I know I was like, I knew eCodices was expensive, but I didn't know just how expensive it was. That was the big shocker for me.
Say that that was direct and indirect costs, right? So, I mean, the one thing that I think can still count on for DS is sweat equity, that all of us who are volunteers and care about it, that we put into it. It doesn't mean that it would be nice to lighten that up, but I think, you know, Christoph was like trying to map out every possible cost it took to run it.
Yeah, I think just be cautious about one single data point. When you compare the cost of building and maintaining technology systems, it's pretty much apples and zebras. It's not even apples and oranges, because the costs are just so variable. Time is, you know, costs different amounts in different regions. And yeah, so just as one example, I worked at Rutgers University. We got bids for just a plain old website from 100,000 to 450,000 for the exact same work, right? So, you know, costs can be minimized, as Dan talked about. And I think that's really, I assume, some technology evaluation and selection as part of your planning grant. And that would be a very critical part to kind of invest time and effort in.
I don't know if we've explicitly put that in the planning grant as far as deciding on the technology. You know, we started off thinking that coming up with a data model would be the core issue. And I think, I still think that is a core issue, but also like the workflow for how we're going to get data into this thing is perhaps more important. I mean, if we're going with a very simple record, the data model will also be pretty simple.
I think that's right. I think the workflow is really the biggest challenge for us. You know, how we're going to relate to participating institutions, how we're going to store the records, who's going to be responsible for the data, how we're going to get the data, what we're going to do with it. You know, that feels to me like the biggest, scariest, most complicated problem that we have to solve.
One thing that we've been talking about in other meetings, and I think a couple of the groups mentioned this also, is the need to standardize manuscript descriptions in libraries. And I'm wondering from any of the catalogers here, like if DS sent out a mandate for how to catalog manuscripts in a MARC record, would you follow that mandate? Would you be able to convince your institution to let you change your records so that they could be more easily ingested into DS?
Well, those standards exist. People just don't follow them necessarily.
Got to get it past like the head of your cataloging department, which is a senior cataloger that has probably no experience in manuscripts, but has their pet peeves about certain things like how you use LCSH, you know, Library of Congress subject headings. It's,
right, exactly. 650s, that's where they go to the mat.
Yeah, you're totally right.
Yeah. They'll fight to the death. Yeah.
It has to be about the thing. It can't be the thing. That's why it's also really hard. That's why it's really hard to find manuscripts in WorldCat, because you can't say it's a manuscript, because you have to say, you have to use the subject headings to say what it's about, not what it is.
Right.
You can't say it's a book of hours if it is a book of hours. It's crazy stuff.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, it would be amazing if Digital Scriptorium could actually finally once and for all put that question to bed and set a standard. But that is a huge, huge
no, they will go to their death over it.
Yeah, that's a waste of time. Don't even go. If we develop a standard, I'm out of here, because I've been through so many standards, the noise of them wishing by as somebody says, this is perfect, everybody has to do this. We're just simply incapable of doing it. Don't waste time trying to do it again.
The words of wisdom.
How do you really feel about this, Bill? Well, this was the problem that Digital Scriptorium set out to solve 25 years ago.
Yeah, we're not going back there. We're not going back there.
I mean, it's impossible. It can't be done. 3 librarians, 5 standards. That's how it goes.
But if it became a matter of getting your data into a National Union catalog and your library administration was saying you need to do this.
No, I still wouldn't do it.
No. I'll find a way, Bill Stoneman. I'll find a way.
It's just a fool. I'm sorry, it's a fool's errand to try and develop standards.
But I think you can say, maybe not for the whole record, but you could, perhaps you could say we need these data elements.
Yeah, we could.
Like we're looking for these specific data elements.
We can do that.
Where are they in your records? We're not looking for
Maybe,
the whole, like we don't need subject headings, maybe, right? So we don't have to worry about that.
Infiltrate library science programs to try and brainwash students from the ground up.
I think the better way, and institutions are not going to change their records, and they're not going to change the way they do things. If you want to say to them, these are the data elements we're trying to get out of your record, and we're having trouble finding consistency or finding it in your record, then you might get a response, but they are not going to change their records.
And I feel as though that's something that Metascripta is doing really well, is by focusing on controlled elements that are being used in institutions' records already. And I also thought it was really impressive that if you were starting from scratch, the recommendation where to find, like, a recommended thesaurus, a recommended, those are things that somebody could do to put together the minimal elements that that Digital Scriptorium said it needed.
And for institutions that are starting from scratch creating records in their OPAC, Digital Scriptorium could help design and give guidance. And we've done that already, right? I mean, that's what I did when I was working with Chris Farber at Tufts. And what I did at the Boston Public Library was make recommendations as to how you can best craft a discoverable manuscript record in your OPAC. But that's only, you're never going to get people to go backwards and edit their records. But if people are starting from scratch and want to be part of Digital Scriptorium, then you may be able to have that kind of influence, I think.
And the other benefit to focusing on controlled vocabulary is that that will change much more slowly in terms of maintenance. So if a record in Digital Scriptorium consists of the controlled elements that say are in a meta scripta record, you know, we're not going to be randomly changing the birth date of Aristotle and have to fix that in a record. If we are sharing a VIAF or name authority, that's just going to change much more slowly than the descriptive notes in our records.
Marianne Swearing put it in the chat that this is why creating a linked data environment would be beneficial. And I think that's something that we haven't talked a lot about explicitly, but I think that that is going to be the answer ultimately. So thank you for putting that in the chat, Marianne.
Oh gosh, we're almost at time. Lynn, did you?
Well, the only thing I want to say is Emma Thompson did a fantastic job pulling this together. So round of applause. This was supposed to be a 2.5-day in-person meeting, and we had to change it up very quickly as soon as she started. And I think it's just I couldn't have asked for a better planning meeting event, right, Deborah?
Oh, I think it's great.
Yeah.
I don't know if everybody else had as much fun as I did, but
this was wonderful.
You know,
yeah, it's been fun. So I just want to say thank you to Emma and thank you to everybody for your early active participation. We have a lot of good data.
Yeah, and everyone stuck around for all 4 days, which is really exciting. And I hope we all stay in touch, you know, we have a year, or well, slightly less than a year left in our planning grant. But I think we are going to have another set of meetings at some point, and they will probably be virtual again, given how the world is going. So towards the end of the grant. So you can stay in touch with us on Twitter, on the DS website. And I think I have all your emails now, so I'll try to stay in touch that way also.
And we'll be putting out progress reports, maybe posting them probably on the DS all list, right, Deborah?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, we've got a really robust mailing list now, so we can keep everybody in touch. And we also have a mailing list for who participate. I don't have it up to date yet, but if you participated and we don't have your email, if you came in and you sort of jumped in later or you didn't, as long as you registered, we'll have it, right, Emma?
Yeah.
Yeah. But and yeah, any stowaways, just send your email to Emma. It's so cool. Thank you so much.
Child on Sabina's lap.
Children.
Love it. Yay, guys.
Thank
you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Mwah. Love you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, thank you. I think Amy's just stepped away from her desk.
Yeah.
Is Deborah gone?
Yeah. Here, I can stop recording now.
That was great.